Hello, role-playing people! It recently occurred to me that I've been making Demon the Fallen episodes and mentioning the pit for quite a while now, but we've never actually had a look at what the pit is. So let's try to map out that abyss where the Fallen were imprisoned for millennia and maybe catch a glimpse of what being there was like. Interestingly enough, according to Gaviel's recollection of events, humanity's current vision of hell is nothing like the pit. Instead, it is trauma that was passed down through the generations from mortals who resided in Dudael. Dudael was the desert bastion of the Ebon Legion, a place surrounded by perpetual fires and geysers that constantly belched forth noxious gases, poisoning the surrounding lands. The forges beneath the city churned out endless weapons and armor for the mortal ranks which served Abaddon and his rebels. When they weren't out slaughtering the loyalist mortals and host, the Ebon Legion organized grotesque gladiatorial spectacles in which they pinned humans against each other or against various monstrosities that this legion could easily engineer using their lores. So, according to Gaviel, hell as mortals know it comes from Dudael. But what of the pit? The experience of being in the pit is actually described by another signature character, Magdiel, a slayer who is inhabiting the body of one Anila Kaul. Magdiel remembers the pit as, I quote, "a cold, empty void, barren of anything but us. We could make nothing there to ease our imprisonment, for there was no material for us to work with. We were utterly alone. The only things left to us were our memories and our regrets." Aha! We were utterly alone, says Magdiel, collectively imprisoned. So if the Fallen had each other, then certainly the pit cannot be described as a sensory deprivation chamber, right? Well, yes and no. According to the same character, the spirits of the dead did occasionally interact with the Fallen. They somehow wandered either into the pit or nearby and were immediately taken by demons and tortured in mindless, uncontrollable rage and need for stimulation. In a later chapter, we find out this is because of the Great Maelstroms, the first 5 great maelstroms which rattled the entire abyss but never managed to break it. Wraiths caught in these maelstroms probably washed up either around or even inside the pit and were caught by the Fallen. This tells us something about the location of the abyss. It's definitely somewhere in the low umbra, perhaps at the bottom of the labyrinth. Maybe it is oblivion itself, that core of entropy, a realm that desires nothing more than destruction but somehow keeps existing. Alright, so now we know some contact was possible, and we also learn from the same character's memories that the Fallen could somehow feel humanity's call. They could feel the longing of the living, their desire to have their supernatural mentors and companions back, their horror of being left all alone in a world they didn't understand. But all the prisoners could do is watch helplessly as humanity fell deeper into despair and fear, eventually forgetting about its guardians altogether, perhaps also due to the absence of the host, an almost total absence of all celestials. Mortals were just abandoned on Earth. Again, at this point, the pit doesn't sound like a sensory deprivation chamber, but it's important to understand that even when communicating with each other during their imprisonment, the Fallen used invocation because they didn't have physical bodies or sensory organs. They are spirits. So, though the character says they heard the call of the living, we can only imagine exactly how they perceived such things in the midst of the painful nothingness that was the pit. What's clear is the experience wasn't pleasant at all and served only to amplify the torment of the rebels. Invocation did pretty much the same thing, endlessly stoking the fires of regret, blame, and anger. Magdiel remembers that the highest of the fallen actually used invocation to come to know their underlings' true names. So the result of this was that lesser demons became slaves which would serve their masters with complete involuntary devotion. This kind of communication is also what helped form the factions, somewhat based on what remained of the ideologies and goals of the legions. But now we're talking about true names, and as both the core book and the novels show us, Fallen can be commanded into non-existence by these names. So why didn't the rebels just command each other into non-being to spare themselves the agony of imprisonment? I think the reason for that is the fact that the Abyss is already outside of creation, it's already in non-being. You can bring a fallen from the pit of nothingness back into the mortal world using summoning, but I don't think you can destroy a fallen who is basically already taken out of creation. The principles that apply to creation and the human world don't function the way they should in the Abyss. Think about it. These entities were architects of an entire reality and guardians of humanity. It is in their nature to create and change things, and they were thrown into a place where absolutely nothing exists except for themselves. Makes sense they would crave destruction after a while to make the agony stop, but I couldn't find a single mention of the rebels destroying each other in such a way using their true names, probably because it couldn't be done. Certainly, all the commanding generals who now called themselves archdukes would have experimented with names they had at their disposal to see exactly what the limits are, but the prison could not be broken and the prisoners could not be unmade by their true names. However, and this is probably how most threats and battles were carried out in the pit, they could cannibalize each other. So all of a sudden, that infinitely small comfort of invoking your comrades just to have some semblance of company becomes a horrifying risk. You don't want anyone finding out too much about your past deeds, because if they can figure out your nature and decrypt your name, you're lunch. Some of them will eat you. But then the archdukes vanish. And at first, the prisoners are hopeful. They're thinking, maybe something is happening. Nope, nothing is happening. The archdukes are gone for good, and the others are left to despair in the pit. After a while, Zaforiel, one of the lesser fallen, vanishes as well, but also returns to the Abyss. What Zaforiel tells the rebels fills them with dread and awe, since it wasn't the giver or the host who summoned this prisoner, but a man who commanded Zaforiel into giving up house lores and other names. A curious and quite frightening idea. Shortly after, more summonings follow. So now there's also incentive to share your name, at least the celestial one, with as many faction buddies as possible, because hey, being a slave to mankind is actually way worse than being a slave to your own kind, but it's probably way better than existing in a constant state of agonizing nothingness. So now everyone is trading names, hoping to be summoned next. While some powerful demons are commanding their thralls into delivering their names to mortal summoners, others simply take advantage of their gullible comrades and turn them into slaves, or eat their souls. And then it finally happens, after 5 maelstroms that did nothing but to offer the fallen brief spectacles of fear and pain as the souls of the dead were thrown against the walls of the pit. The 6th maelstrom happens, and this time the prison cracks, the walls of the prison crack. Now, most Demon the Fallen reviews, including some episodes on this very channel, when summing up the events that followed the breaking of the prison, will tell you that a few prisoners escaped of their own will. They just went out into the Tempest and left the greater demons behind, which is certainly true for a small minority of demons who managed to dodge becoming someone else's slave, or they were unimportant enough that the higher ranks simply didn't care about them. We also know some of the hosts were thrown into the pit as well, for various reasons. For example, Uziel, whose bloodlust became so great during the war that the host considered him fundamentally changed by that experience, broken and unfit to serve in their ranks. It's very unlikely that someone like Uziel was being controlled by another in the Abyss, so they probably made their flight of their own volition. Yes, greater demons could not fit through the cracks of the prison, so they could not escape directly, but it certainly doesn't mean they won't find a way to escape using the others. According to Magdiel, the higher ranks commanded their lessers to jump into the Tempest, get their butts into the mortal world, and find some way of assisting their own escape. So this is actually a huge part of the tension and the horror of Demon, one that I also overlook or forget sometimes. The Fallen didn't just escape and that's that, but they were sent out to assist someone else's escape. Almost everyone is or was someone else's slave. Yes, you arrive in the world and your memories meld with those of the human host, ridding you of your torment and even making you forget your promises, maybe. But when the time comes, you will be called to serve. You gave your name in that pit. You swore allegiance to someone in the Abyss if they didn't take it by force, that is. And you sided with a faction. Your master isn't going to care about your new mortal family and your current affiliations. You're nothing but a tool to them, a servant. And when they also come out of the pit, or awaken in their reliquary, if they are unearthbound, you will serve, and you might just be powerless to resist. So the mortal world is undoubtedly a playground for any fallen who's just emerged from the pit. But what will you do when the one who holds your very soul in the palm of their hand also comes into the world and commands your servitude? Clock's ticking. It's only a matter of time. Ah, but it's not just infernal monsters pulling your strings. It will also be the Abyss itself, which is what I find the most tragic part in all of this. All characters, as soon as they take their first leap out of the pit and towards the mortal world, or as soon as they are dispatched from the host that anchored them, they feel the pull of the Abyss, a call to return to that agonizing nothingness which forces you to keep existing and doesn't let you feel anything but pain. It's a horrifying call. You know it's an eternity of agony, but hell is where you belong at this point, isn't it? You deserve it. You've been in it for so long. It's part of you. You've internalized it. The worst agony that could ever be bestowed upon a self-aware entity, but it's familiar, isn't it? And if you think about it, with the giver and the host gone, with the second world being a mystery to slayers and mortals alike, with the very few layers that have either endured the fall or grew out of a divine potential mankind cannot even comprehend, the earth is just another prison, just another abyss, designed not for the fallen, but for their loyal humans. So there we have it, a brief and quite horrifying reminder of the abyss, a prison, a war zone, a sensory deprivation chamber, a one-way window into the collective suffering of humanity, and a constant call of the void, all in one. And though that pull is always there, the last thing any character wants, short of being cannibalized, is to go back to the pit. Thank you very much for listening, take care, have fun, and don't forget to play.